Now, Druv sir is here. Okay, I can see. So we're also extremely delighted to have with us today Professor Raina from Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, JNU. He is going to speak on the sciences and social sciences after Adorno-Popper debate, lessons for today. By way of introduction, Professor Raina is a philosopher and historian of science from India. He studied physics at the Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai, and received his PhD in the philosophy of science from Gothenburg University. His research has focused upon the politics and cultures of scientific knowledge in South Asia. In 2002, he was appointed associate professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University and had been a professor since 2004. He teaches history and philosophy of sciences as well as education. In 2007, he became a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies, Berlin. And in 2010, he became first incumbent of Heinrich Zimmer Chair for Intellectual History and Indian Philosophy. He also has served as honorary director of Northern Regional Center of Indian Council for Social Science Research. We are so delighted to have you with us, sir, on this FDP. Now, dear participants, before I hand over the session to Professor Raina, he's going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll get 10 to 15 minutes or so for the question and answer round. For questions, you are welcome to put them in the chat. Also, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, our team has got an eye on YouTube as well. So please feel free to put your questions there on the live stream as well. Please submit your feedback form, which is very important. I think it has already been shared with you. So during the session, whatever you have any queries, please put it up in the chat box. We'll pick it up from there. So I'm not wasting more time. So over to you, and thank you once again for joining us. So.
Yeah. All right. Thank you,
Mansi.
Yeah. Thank you, Mansi, for having invited me. I don't know if I'm the right person to speak at this FDP, but well, since Mansi insisted, I will speak to social scientists. As you know, I trained as a scientist who strayed into the social sciences, but I still continue to study the sciences, but as a social scientist. Now, the subject of this talk is motivated by two related research themes that have been of concern for some time now. The first has to do with the emergence of interdisciplinarity, and the second with the need to forge broad interdisciplinary fields across the sciences and the social sciences, particularly when we begin to reflect upon and engage with our planetary future. We have seen interdisciplinary fields thrive, but within the range of what philosophers of science call narrow interdisciplinarity, meaning an interdisciplinarity forged between epistemically neighboring disciplines, for example, biology and chemistry. All right? Example being biochemistry, biophysics, etc. However, broad interdisciplinarity has been more difficult to develop for a number of reasons. One of them is the historical legacy of the evolution of disciplines and the associated disciplinary differentiation along methodological lines. In this process of differentiation between disciplines, two debates have been of historical importance. The method and strike, or the debate over method, the fight over method, from the end of the 19th century, separating the sciences of explanation like the social sciences, like the natural sciences, from the sciences of understanding of the social sciences or the social sciences, which was followed half a century later with the positivism strike, or the fight over positivism, in which The debate between Popper and Adorno has been canonized as an important moment in the sedimentation of disciplinary boundaries between the sciences and the social sciences, so called. Now, the issues surrounding these debates were amplified with the culture wars that play themselves out between the sciences and the social sciences every couple of decades. The last outburst was the science wars during the 1990s. Those of you who are students now were probably not born then, I don't know. In this talk, I shall try to develop an argument for a rapprochement between the two cultures from the history and philosophy of science. I shall draw largely upon the work of the philosopher of science Yehuda Elkanah, the sociologist of science Steve Fuller, the philosopher Richard Rorty, and the social theorist Patrick Butt. All right. The philosophy of science recognizes methodological distinctions, but more importantly, highlights methodological similarities and concerns that make them both robust knowledge endeavors. The issues being signaled are not new, but progress along the axis of pedagogic improvisation that has been incremental and fraught with conceptual and other impediments. Now, the history and philosophy of science is very rarely evoked in discussions of higher education, at least in India. The neglect has proved costly, although educationists and science teachers are aware of the importance of what are referred to as problems of teaching leading to scientific research, and that of developing instructional protocols for knowledge emerging at the frontiers of scientific research. Part of the problem arises from popular perceptions or the imaginary of the field of history and philosophy of science as addressing the genesis of scientific ideas and the priority of scientific ideas on the timeline of accomplishments. Few know that the history and philosophy of science is primarily concerned with addressing the dynamics of the growth of scientific ideas, the conceptual of scientific ideas and the conceptual evolution of scientific evolutions, of scientific institutions and disciplines. But more importantly, with excavating the relationship between the social and the scientific. So in this talk, I draw upon some of the insights from the philosophy of science and its resonances with our contemporary concerns with the future of higher education. While recognizing that the loci of higher education in the contemporary world are quite distributed, and as the important book, The New Production of Knowledge, argues, the university is no longer the center of knowledge production. And yet, it is incontestable that it is still the most important center for the production and reproduction of knowledge. So much so that Thomas Söderqvist once pointed out that 80% of all knowledge produced was produced within the last 150 years within the confines of the university. Over the centuries, the university has undergone transformations and radically metamorphosed itself as society has changed, presenting itself to us in different forms over the last 3 centuries. The Liberal Arts College, the Humboldtian Modern Research University, the Multiversity of the 1960s, and finally today, the commercialized universities of the globalized world. While these forms appear in a chronological sequence, they coexist today, comprising the ecology of higher education with a rich institutional and cognitive identity. Thus, the university has traveled over the centuries. It has metamorphosed and diversified, reflecting both its adaptability and resilience. Sometimes the rate of socio-political change and economic realities have outpaced institutional and cognitive reform and change within the university. In this narrative of change and innovation, we need to reflect upon what I like to call the traveling university, or the traveling idea of the university, and its ontogeny, on account of which universities at different stages in the timeline can be linked to each other to become part of a university system whose extent today is global. The additional feature is that while the university has traveled and diversified, there is a strong family resemblance between universities. By the last decades of the 19th century, the universities distributed across Europe and Asia and Latin America, we witness the structures of higher education coalesce into a connected global but not necessarily unitary system. This connectivity by the end of the 20th century is reflected in the internationalization of higher education, enhanced by collaborative research and increased student mobility. Against this backdrop, I would like to approach the university as a connected global system where the disciplines are distributed between the sciences, the social sciences, and humanities, unfortunately with few intersections, and the system reproduces itself through a pedagogy that emphasizes distinct methodological orientations. These distinctions mark disciplinary identities and are reaffirmed by the methodological training in the social sciences or the sciences. The social sciences incorporate several of the issues raised in the Popper-Adorno debate, which becomes part of a curriculum without necessarily mentioning the two figures or the debate. But today, for reasons mentioned earlier, it would be worthwhile to focus on what draws these two figures together to extract lessons for our own times rather than emphasize the differences highlighted by the camp followers. The two. Steve Fuller has argued that Popper was a deeply dialectical thinker whose ideas evolved in opposition to the dominant discourses of his time. As a dialectical thinker, his positive views disguised negative ones. His version of deductivism or the hypothetical deductive was in fact anti-inductivism. His liberalism was developed as anti-authoritarianism in spirit. His individualism was formulated as anti-holism. The body of Popper's work is so enormous that there is virtually no area of philosophy that escaped his critical rationalism. The current generation of philosophers have had to deal with his thought, parceled out into specialties. Falsification and the methodology of the sciences, one domain, political liberalism, the second, the philosophy of social sciences, the third, and the work he did in the last years of his life with the neurobiologist John Eccles on the self and its brain. Adorno's social theory rejected the idea of philosophy 0 degree, or the possibility of philosophizing from nowhere. And on this point too, Popper in his criticism of the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists argued against a neutral observation language comprising protocol sentences. All observation for him was in some sense theory-laden. Okay, so thus both reckoned with the socio-historical embeddings of conceptual and theoretical schemas. Philosophically too, Adorno shared the fate of Popper, a consequence of the professional and institutional differentiation within philosophy and the disciplines more generally. His contributions were parceled out into 4 readerships into the domain of high modernist aesthetics, Hegelian epistemology, Marxist sociology, and finally post-Holocaust ethics. Adorno's student, the political philosopher Jürgen Habermas, played an important role in shifting the center of gravity of Adorno's social theory from Marxism to American pragmatism. In 1961, Popper and Adorno participated at the meeting of the German Sociological Association at Tübingen and launched the Positivismus-Streit, or the battle over positivism, or the conflict over positivism in German social theory. Naturally, the focus of the discussion was over general attitudes and issues rather than on the actual protocols of scientific inquiry. However, the camp followers of the two sides pitted them as antagonists, and the fallout has had unintended consequences despite their common opposition to positivism. Both were seen as opponents of positivism, but the camp followers posed them as opponents against each other. And as Stephen argues in his book on the Popper-Kuhn debate, Adorno and Popper actually resembled each other on a number of counts. Both shared an aversion for analytical philosophy of sciences and for the practitioners of what subsequently came to be known as cultural studies. But the most important significant fallout for the academic world of this debate was that it compromised what Fuller calls the rationalist left, and in the process strengthened the neoliberal and anti-rational right. According to Fuller, the rationalist left included the now divided world of critical theorists that included Adorno and his Marxist followers, and the critical rationalists led by Popper and his liberal acolytes. The fallout of the positivist strike was that it dissipated the force of critique in the academy into ever so many camps. The long-term consequence of which has been, in our own time, a subversion of the unified defense of the university as the primary site for the pursuit of autonomous inquiry. At the Tübingen conference, it was observed that in the first instance, there was an overall consensus that both Popper and Adorno were staunchly anti-positivist. Secondly, both were opposed to the style of grand theorizing and the abstracted empiricism of structural functionalist sociology critiqued by Wright Mills. Thirdly, both were opposed to what may be termed essentialism in the social sciences, more specifically to psychological or economic reductionism. And finally, both disowned the idea of a disunified science. This implied that disciplinary boundaries were not to be taken too seriously, especially when they inhibited the capacity for independent critical judgment on the state of knowledge. This fragmentation and disciplinary segmentation on methodological lines impeded the possibility of arriving at a unified understanding of reality. And finally, Popper did not believe that the categories of the natural sciences were closer to reality than those of the social sciences, and Adorno would have concurred entirely. In other words, concepts for them were socio-historically conditioned, and the merit of these concepts resided in their analytical purchase. And while Adorno may have co-authored the Dialectic of the Enlightenment, both he and Popper shared the Enlightenment ideal that philosophy had a social role, and this role involved interrogating taken for granted beliefs and ideas considered commonsensical. Where did they differ? This is fundamental in that it was a disagreement about the future of the Enlightenment project. For Adorno, totalitarianism and consumer capitalism had pushed the Enlightenment project to its self-destructive extreme. For Popper, as in the domain of scientific knowledge, the Enlightenment project had yet to be realized. Both science and society were in a state of permanent revolution. There were differences then in their views of the sciences. Adorno began to see the sciences and social sciences as instruments of power, while for Popper, science had developed means for adjudicating between scientific theories. Ostensibly, the opposition between them is ascribable to that between liberalism and Marxism that was a legacy of the Cold War landscape. in our own world today, they would have been comrades in arms. What lessons can we take back from Fuller's reconstruction of the debate? The first is that we as scholars need to look at the debates and divides that draw borders between academies in historical and related conceptual contexts. The more important point is that the Cold War was not the first and is certainly not the last ideological framing that divided the academy. And as academics, we need to be aware of the consequences of these framings and how future framings already on the horizon may divide the academy. But you could ask, why is this important? Both Popper and Adorno lived through very dark, and having lived through dark times, they upheld the ideal of the unity of mankind and believed that this ideal could be preserved if it was founded on the idea of the unity of knowledge. Malachi Hakohen, in his work entitled Popper in Red Vienna, points out why the members of the Vienna Circle, largely Jewish mathematicians, physicists, and philosophers, subscribe to the idea of the unified sciences when everywhere around them there was a clamor for Aryan physics. Hempel, after the war, even launched the International Encyclopedia of the Unified Social Sciences, in which Thomas Kuhn participated. The third is the dire need in dark times to defend a robust ideal of knowledge. Not anything can pass for knowledge. Beliefs and rationality need to be distinguished from knowledge, and this can be done by setting high standards of argumentation and validity. And it is indeed heartening to see philosophers of science today addressing the epistemology of fake news and related knowledge concerns. The fourth is the need to defend the unity of the academy and the university, as well as the diversity within the academy and the university. Not only as a site for the production and distribution of knowledge, but as its home and dwelling. And finally, the ideal of unified knowledge, however redefined within a postmodern world, compels an interrogation, as the previous speaker signaled, of the very silos we inhabit within the disciplines or within interdisciplinary fields. This border crossing is not only important for advancing the frontiers of knowledge, but of ensuring not just our conceptual sanity, but of our disciplinary and interdisciplinary belongings. I come now to the second part of my talk that proceeds to the world after the Popper-Adorno debate. Those familiar with the history and social studies of science from the 1960s onwards will be aware of two central issues that have boggled historians and philosophers of the sciences. The first has to do with the just mentioned critique of the European Enlightenment project that informed much of the research of the time. But the second concern anchored within developments of a movement referred to as constructivism within the sociology of scientific knowledge. These movements challenge the objectivity and universality of scientific knowledge. This critique was re-articulated from other theoretical perspectives, namely the feminist philosophy of science, post-colonial philosophy of science, and post-colonial theory of science. In addition, the standard conception of science was disputed on several other counts that I shall not take up here, since they are not immediately salient to the matter to be discussed. In the light of the argument of the social embeddedness of knowledge forms, it is important to recognize that pragmatism too had internalized the opposition to any transcendental form of inquiry, grounding aesthetic, ethical, or cognitive claims. The social sciences, on the contrary, were premised on historical and cultural analysis. Over the last half century, we have engaged with the inability to ground our knowledge on atemporal foundations, outside of history. Following the developments in post-colonial philosophy of science, post-structuralism, feminist philosophy of science, we have learned that our theories cannot escape the conceptual systems framing them. This recognition does not necessarily lead to the idea that our knowledge is subjective or relative. Yehuda Elkanah, the historian and philosopher of science, his work was deeply inspired by the thinking of the German neo-Kantian thinker Ernst Cassirer, who in the 1920s embarked on a re-examination of the Enlightenment. The imaginary of, yeah, just in and around the time that Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger had embarked on a similar project. Inspired equally by the work of the philosopher of science Imre Lakatos, Yehuda Elkanah considered developing a Cassirerian research program for a post-World War II context. I think it could even be a post-Cold War context. In this reading, the pursuit of knowledge does not entail the search for transcendental universal truth, but with knowledge that was socially or historically situated. The theory of knowledge he is proposing aims at contextualizing knowledge in its historical emergence. Put differently, in a language that weaves the philosophy of science with the history of science, historical epistemology has a genealogy that extends from Bachelard and Canguilhem to Hawking, Daston, and Reinberger. Elkanah attempts to develop his own approach as a Cassirerian historical epistemology. This entailed developing the program whose goal was to prioritize the contextualization of knowledge and the interaction between several constellations of knowledge in the interest of a vigorous interdisciplinarity. The culmination of this phase of thinking was a programmatic note he authored with the sociologist Wolf Lepenies entitled Historical Epistemology of Knowledge. Gradually, and that's why I bring him up here, his interests evolved to look at undergraduate and doctoral education, but this writing of his is linked to his interest and research in the history and philosophy of science, while simultaneously cognizant of the institutional transformations in the world of science and larger sociological political changes afflicting society at a global level. In 1981, Elkanah published a paper entitled A Programmatic Attempt at an Anthropology of Knowledge. And it is here that we encounter the first reckoning in his philosophical work with the issues that subsequently animated his intellectual life. A careful reading suggests that he was in a way responding to two central concerns of his time, namely objectivism and contextualism seen as boundaries. And he was transcending these boundaries. The fundamental premises of the debate were that a choice between realism and relativism is unavoidable, that human universals once found can be abstracted from cultural noise, that all reason is epistemic, that once sociological influence on histories of idea are admitted, we must give up the hope for a rational explanation of great historical changes. Elkanah rejected these presuppositions of objectivism and posed a couple of counter theses. And the rest of his paper then turns to anthropology, psychology, and history to argue these claims. His counter theses are as follows: that realism and relativism are simultaneously followed by most people or most issues, that we participate in two-tier thinking. Second, the quest for human universals outside a cultural context is meaningless, though the quest for human universals itself is not. Three, that there exists at least one other kind of reason, namely metic, Reason. 4. That once we realize that no sufficient and necessary conditions for historical change can be found, necessary conditions for change can be rationally analyzed, but it must be understood that all knowledge follows also the rules of dramatic theatre. In the process, he distanced himself from any commitment to the ontological claims of postmodernism and defended what he would have called a Caesarian contextualism. While he responded sensitively to the critique of the Enlightenment, without rejecting it, he initiated thinking on a new enlightenment for the university. He argued that the Enlightenment remained the basic foundation for knowledge-making enterprise for 300 years, after which internal fissures that had been accumulating began to propagate and rather, instead of unthinking the Enlightenment, how does one rethink the Enlightenment, he asked. The idea is elaborated in a number of papers and lectures and commences in the recognition that all knowledge is contextual and that the process of the production of knowledge amidst scientific work involves decisions that are political. In other words, the making of knowledge rather than driven by a truth-seeking engine is context-dependent and requires embracing contradictions and not just eliminating them. Embracing contradictions does not imply that contradictions are to be accepted, but entails the recognition that the knowledge enterprise is cluttered with contradictions, and the Enlightenment strategy was to isolate and eradicate them. He turns to the history and philosophy of science to instantiate the idea of embracing contradictions. Thus, in the history of classical physics, the problem of the perihelion of Mercury was known for a long time. It was Einstein who showed that the problem was not one that deserved to be edged out of research concerns of the discipline or eliminated from the discipline, but was so central that the resolution required a new physics. But who decides what is central and peripheral to the discipline? Evidently, this choice or decision is made by a group of scholars who take it upon themselves to investigate something that had hitherto been considered peripheral or contradictory. This approach, in a manner of speaking, is influenced by the writing of the Dutch historian of physics and physicist Dijksterhuis, who said that the history of science is the epistemological laboratory of science. And Elkanah was convinced or sought to convince his readers that historical epistemology has a deep bearing upon graduate education in the sciences. And this is an idea I shall delve upon very briefly. Let us run through the justification for incorporating a historical epistemology of the sciences into the curriculum, keeping the core idea in the background that this would be the basis of the new Enlightenment. Contrary to the consensual view of science, it is pointed out that there is a great deal of controversy within the sciences. Normally, people think that the sciences are about consensus. Controversy is only in the social sciences. Multiple interpretations are only in the social sciences. That is part of our pedagogic training. In order to appreciate the relevance of these controversies and why they are important for the evolution of the sciences, graduate students need an exposure to the basic epistemological concerns about what constitutes knowledge and knowing, and the issues that confront the sciences even now. This entails inquiring and appreciation of the organization of knowledge, images of the possible, standards of validity, precision, and vigor. And appreciation of the sciences requires recognizing the significance of the contradictions and inconsistencies within the sciences, and the function of the pedagogue is to highlight the regime where theories fail, where favored theories fail. This kind of approach, as philosophy of science suggests, catalyzes thinking about alternate theories. and ways of looking at problems, drawing open the possibility of questioning received theories that dominate the landscape of science at any one time. In other words, philosophical argument, the philosophical argument has precedent, but its reworking in an educational context is new. But this exposure is not to be limited to the frontiers of received disciplines, such as physics or chemistry, but around which undergraduate education is organized. Contextualism is to be extended as part of the coursework in doctoral research programs, which means introducing philosophical, sociological, and methodological determinants and perspectives in social science and science courses. The exercise is to be constantly refreshed during the course of a cohort's doctoral program in order to develop meta-theoretical skills of students to critically step back and reflect on them. So doctoral students don't just have to go through one methodology course, but several times in the course of their career, they need to undergo this kind of exposure to contextualism. The exercise, all right, as part of doctoral mentoring, the peers and research leaders in a discipline need to emphasize the critical and pedagogical functions of critical work that extend far beyond that of research. Doctoral students need to be alerted to aspects of their future, for most will spend more time teaching and interacting with varied publics, as the previous speaker emphasized. That includes industry, policy, and community settings, rather than at the frontiers of science or in the university. Most doctoral students will be interacting with. In the light of the climate crisis and the pandemic, part of the doctoral student socialization would be to conceptualize scientific and social scientific work for an intensely globalized world. We need to think outside the boundaries of the nation. The contextualization of discipline also helps overcome another issue that resides at the core of doctoral instruction in the academy and takes on the dimensions of a cultural and ideological divide. Doctoral programs in the sciences and social sciences tend to asymmetrically undermine the social sciences with respect to the former and thereby create hierarchies. The sciences in this imaginary are characterized as being exact and robust, with clear focused problem definition and a commitment to consensus seeking. While the imaginary of the social sciences is indeed antithetical to this. The reality is that there is greater controversy in the sciences than the practitioners of science acknowledge or are even aware of. Consequently, graduate students in the sciences are seduced by the imaginary into believing in a dream world of putative consensus and shared premises, while the social sciences are seen to be immobilized by their interpretive flexibility and multiplicity of perspectives. While not disagreeing that the humanities and social sciences are messy, in that they are marked by turmoil and deal with complexity, you could add that the natural sciences are no different. For even in the natural sciences, there are no theories of everything, primarily because theoretical structures are far from complete. Their foundations are mired in presupposition and contradictions, and these presuppositions themselves constantly shift and are revised as the theories themselves evolve. In other words, sorry, I am just coming out of my COVID, so my cough hasn't gone away. In other words, in the humanities and social sciences, disagreements on basics is considered an intellectual desideratum. Analogous differences in the sciences are never verbalized in the socialization of doctoral students. All right. The consensus, what I like to call the consensus about consensus in the sciences, has resulted in the marginalization of the space for dialectical thinking. Though dialectical thinking fundamentally engages with contradictions, concomitantly recognizing that different framings of questions yield different answers. Elkanah points out that in the curricular world, dialectical thinking, unfortunately, is often dismissed as Marxist and its promise lost to the contemporary academy. How does one explain this blanket acceptance of a culture of consensus or the consensus about consensus? In the essential tension, Kuhn had argued that as a science becomes more mature or a theory gets uh, uh, increasingly formalized, the polysemy surrounding the theory collapses and it becomes monoparadigmatic, ergo consensual. Once the idea of consensus is accepted, it follows that the compulsions for conceptual change or scientific revolution are internally generated, and hence there is no need to educate students otherwise. But scientists such as Weinberg disagree with Kuhn in arguing that there is no science in which, in any stage of its development, the science is monoparadigmatic. Leaders of a scientific field are always articulating competing paradigms. The whole field of the history of concepts and even the history of ideas would suggest that in practice, the social sciences accept and welcome this feature as intrinsic to the pursuit of the sciences. The remedy does not reside in making changes to the content of the doctoral program in the sciences, but in focusing attention in addition to aspects that are ignored by the protocols internalized by science students. A survey among doctoral students as to what consists of knowledge would disclose how inadequate their conception of knowledge is. How do students learn to orient their research in a disciplinary or interdisciplinary format when confronted with competing paradigms and contradictions? All right. Many philosophers of science argue that the process of disciplinary specialization has destroyed the skills of doctoral students to cope with this messiness. So they choose the easy way out, which I call methodological fetishism. All right. Now, so what Elkanah's work basically takes us to is that he sees this opportunity to bring in hermeneutics into the science disciplines. The point was driven home in the work of Patrick Heelan, who pointed out that science too has its hermeneutic tasks. The ideology of science articulated among scientists is founded on the ideal of scientific consensus formulated in terms of a neutral, value-free, context-dependent scholarly pursuit. Right? But as just discussed, one cannot subscribe to an ideal that is the very antithesis of this ideal of knowledge. In other words, philosophers of science would argue that political context influenced the socially determined confines of the modern scientific movement without influencing the context of scientific theories. This was the older theory. There has been an inherent tension between epistemology and hermeneutics. For hermeneutics is seen to promote conversation and exchange between different positions. However, in the standard view, epistemology opens the door to the success of the natural sciences, while hermeneutics is the dialogical and interpretive method for understanding poetry, rhetoric, and the humanities in general. Rather than carving up the domain of knowledge between epistemology and hermeneutics, where the epistemology provides access to the objective aspects of knowledge while hermeneutics deals with its non-cognitive manifestations, it would be more productive to recognize that both hermeneutic and epistemology acknowledge that no progress is possible unless there is a shared common ground for the conversation. This is something we learned from Wittgenstein when he was talking about different mathematical games and rules. Rorty denies that there is a one-to-one mapping between a philosophical position and a domain of investigation. So epistemology, natural sciences, hermeneutics, humanities, and social sciences. In fact, there are periods when hermeneutics is applicable to the natural sciences and epistemology to poetry. Taking the Kuhnian insight, this choice is dependent upon when the discourses are normal or abnormal. During a stage of normal science, epistemology may prevail, but during a phase of abnormal or evolutionary science, hermeneutics might be important. This is how conflicting knowledge claims are adjudicated. The important point to recognize is that Kuhn's theory of paradigmatic change is itself marks a change in paradigm in the philosophy of science and in thinking about its methods. It renders questions such as which method is intrinsic to science and how can we model the social sciences on a scientific footing redundant. I have written about the unviability of this distinction between the sciences and social sciences. Nevertheless, there are a couple of insights we can take from Kuhn's work. The first has to do with the recognition that the criteria for the success of theories of the sciences change over time and history. And as these criteria are elaborated and become more internally nested, the less the consensus there is about these criteria. Excuse me, how much time do I have? Can I take another 10 minutes or 5 minutes?
Sure, sir. Sure, sir.
Yeah?
Sure, sir.
All right. Okay. Now, researchers within the history of sciences have been exposed to methodological imperatives of contextualism for at least four decades. Contextualism essentially asks, where does knowledge come from? What problems do communities and collectives decide are important? What is the social context within which knowledge is embedded? We do know that the 19th century was dominated by the rational, dogmatic, universalistic character of the Enlightenment that came to be interrogated by pragmatists such as James, Peirce, Dewey, Toulmin, Rorty, and others. Rethinking the Enlightenment is to confront the frameworks that have defined the creation of knowledge for the last 300 years in the natural sciences, the social sciences, and humanities. In this frame, while complexity was recognized, the actual science was pursued as if it didn't exist. Research was guided by the ideal of rational, universal, context-dependent science that was devoid of contradictions. In the sciences of complexity and the study of nonlinear systems, there is a recognition of the cracks in the wall. The philosopher Justin Smith, in his History of the Dark Side of Reason, points out that the history of rationality also comprises irrationality. The exaltation of reason and a desire to eradicate its opposite, the inevitable endurance of irrationality in human life, and even perhaps especially, or at least especially troublingly, in the movements that set themselves up to eliminate rationality, and finally, the descent into irrational self-immolation by the very currents of thought and social organization that had set themselves up as bulwarks against irrationality, unquote. And so the task is to ensure, with this recognition, that rationality does not slide towards irrationality, but is bolstered by the concept of reasonableness. In other words, our methods should embrace a contextualist reckoning with the historical, social, and political settings for the emergence of concepts and ideas. But it is not significant to recognize this at the frontiers of research. The point is to revise the curriculum of undergraduate education that is not based on the rationality of, say, game theory or rational choice theory. The task should be to enrich and tailor the curriculum by incorporating ways of dealing with complexity. The conception of the new enlightenment is just not to become the basis for reviving the curriculum of an undergraduate program or that of any program in the natural and social sciences, but it is to be extended to professional schools of medicine, engineering, and law. For example, in the work of the psychologist Randolph Ness, there is an attempt to develop a new field of knowledge called evolutionary biology at the intersection of evolutionary biology, medical science, and psychology. And the findings are now incorporated into the teaching and research programs of several medical schools in the USA. In fact, this kind of formulation is of particular relevance to our own times when dealing with the pandemic. These concerns are global in scope and leave room for adaptation to local context. But any engagement with these problems would require an exposure to more than one discipline. The preparation of interdisciplinary undergraduate curricula and graduate curricula would require years of research and a thorough exploration of the scope of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary knowledge. Developing a curriculum is not just an exercise in didactics, but thinking through the foundations of disciplines and requires reimagining disciplines and the interactive boundaries between them. On this count, Yehuda Elkanah was prophetic in suggesting more than a decade ago that interdisciplinary knowledge combining biomedical knowledge with sociology and understanding of historical processes is necessary to the understanding of the spread of infectious diseases. He said this more than a decade ago. Or that of contextuality, of contextually conceived cognitive psychology, which was the science of the future. The approaches to these interdisciplinary fields were still what one would call work in progress and will take years to develop. In recent discussion, there appears to be a strident clamor for critical thinking and research methodology as the magic bullets that would improve the quality of research in our universities. But in official quarters, research methodology is really a euphemism for research methods and techniques that instills methodological fetishism and not critical thinking. The latter half of my talk has hinted that the development of the critical faculty of judgment and exposure to a range of research methods has been undermined by monoparadigmatic doctoral instruction. How do critical thinking and research methods co-constitute research methodology is never elaborated upon. Furthermore, I have argued with my colleague Anirban Chakravarti in a paper that the disciplines, multi, inter, and transdisciplinarity are different moments in the evolution of knowledge and are responses to the problem of overload and integration in that the world of knowledge cyclically encounters as its frontier evolves. So we always encounter the problems of integration and overload, frequently. The moment of multidisciplinarity passed decades ago. Research communities the world over have been forging inter and transdisciplinary fields deeply informed by concerns of complexity, non-linearity, and the boundary crossing between disciplines. We have learned that interdisciplinarity cannot be mandated. The development of robust interdisciplinarity requires a firm grounding on solid disciplinary platforms, a broad interdisciplinarity across the sciences and social sciences, and a team of scientists and social scientists working at the frontiers of their disciplines, university and college teachers spending time and researching the form and content of an undergraduate and graduate program. We need to think about preparing a generation of students for global citizenship. What cognitive and intellectual resources would be required for dealing with the impending calamities and possibility of surviving in the future. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for that very informative and insightful session. Uh, may I now open the session for question and answer round? We have already received two questions. May I ask you, sir, if you would like to respond? Okay. So this is from Anuprita Chatterjee. She's asking, how do we align divergent thinking and dialectical thinking while conducting research?
All right. So one is, I mean, as has been suggested as has, I touched upon the argument. I didn't elaborate it. I mean, within 50 minutes, I could do that. Now, on the one hand, what does contextual thinking do? Contextual thinking places our ideas within a social context. It also tells us, and then, it's not just, what are the social interests behind an idea, or what is the cultural presuppositions behind an idea, but it also has to do with historically situating the evolution of our ideas and concepts. And the moment we begin to situate the evolution of our ideas and concepts, we suddenly see that there is a plurality of perspectives, that there are different ways of interpreting ideas and concepts. In that process itself, I think there is a dialectical recognition of the historical process of the evolution of concepts. I gave the example here of how, on the one hand, you see somebody like Popper, who is an anti-inductivist. All right, he's opposing inductivism, but he basically formulates his ideas of falsification in response to inductivism, in his opposition to inductivism, or how his anti-authoritarianism basically disguises a kind of liberalism. Now, in other words, I think the programmatic attempt to embrace contradictions the way Popper does is itself an exemplar of what dialectical thinking is about.
Okay. Thank you for the response. We have another question coming from Rachna. She's asking, how do we address the manner in which the public, the industry, and the policy consumes interdisciplinary social sciences research?
Wow. You must forgive me. When I began my career, my first papers were on policy. That was 40 years ago. And then after that, I moved very far away from the world of policy. I think it requires a certain kind of arrogance to work on policy, which I cannot prescribe. But that apart, but I think yes, it is important. Now, I think one of the things we need to clarify both for policymakers and the public is, what do we mean by interdisciplinarity? I think it's very important because there are too many foggy ideas about interdisciplinarity which are floating around in the public imaginary and amongst policymakers. When I listen to policymakers most of the time, I think a lot of policymakers, at least within the Indian context, really are really thinking in multidisciplinary terms rather than interdisciplinary terms. And the problem with multidisciplinarity is that multidisciplinarity is organized around the model of industrial production. All right. So what happens is a problem is recognized, and then the problem is subcontracted to various disciplines. Just like in a Maruti factory, a problem. The production process is broken down into the mechanical parts, the electrical parts, the software, this, that, etc. And then they are all pursued independently, and then they are assembled together on a conveyor belt. And at the end of it, the process is left unchanged. Interdisciplinarity is something else. Interdisciplinarity involves an extension, a conceptual, a theoretical, practical and instrumental extension from one field into another. Biochemistry is the extension of the methods of chemistry into biology. It's part of, right? So when we talk about interdisciplinarity arises when further disciplinary differentiation is not working or does not prove optimal for the production of knowledge. Right? That is the moment of interdisciplinarity. And therefore, I think that when we speak about interdisciplinarity, we need to clarify both to the public, etc., that interdisciplinarity is coming together to do something new. And that there is a stage after interdisciplinarity, which is transdisciplinarity, which is another stage in which several fields come together to produce a new framework. In interdisciplinarity, we are just extending the framework of one field into another. As long as, I think this clarity needs to be brought down. One is what they are, but what necessitates it? What necessitates it is, as I said, two problems: the problem of the overload of knowledge and the problem of integration. The disciplines were created in the 18th century when there was a problem of overload and integration. By overload, I mean there was a huge amount of empirical data obtained over the previous 200 years, and you said in which boxes of knowledge should I put it, and how do I integrate this knowledge into the new boxes into which I put it. And then 19th century responded with the creation of what is called temporalization. They put all this data in a temporal sequence, and so you created development or evolutionary theories. That's what the disciplines were about. And what I'm arguing is that today we face another problem of overload and integration, and the response to overload and integration is not disciplinary differentiation, but interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. Yeah.
Thank you.
So as if we understand it and we are able to convey it, it will clarify a lot of things both in the public and for policymakers.
Okay, great. So we are loaded with questions. I hope you're comfortable answering a little more.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have another question coming from Anuprita Chatterjee. She's asking, can we challenge bipolarity of sciences and social sciences using hermeneutics?
Yeah, okay. No, I think I hinted towards that. It's a good question, but I think I hinted towards that. Although I didn't have time to elaborate. Suddenly I realized that I had over-prepared my talk, so I skipped large portions of it. Yes. Now the thing is that you see the link conceptually, the link between bringing hermeneutics into the sciences, all right, and of linking the social sciences with the philosophy of sciences. So how do I link hermeneutics with the sciences? I bring in the relationship between the sciences of interpretation and the fact that Kuhn points out that a paradigm in the sciences is an interpretative framework, and therefore there is a certain interpretative task that the sciences themselves undertake. On the other hand, we also then taken the notion of paradigm into the social sciences, which has already been done. All right. So, in some sense, this cross exchange has occurred. The transition one way has occurred, that is from the philosophy of science to the social sciences, but the other is something we still need to work upon. But the other important point that I think Lorty is making, and that's an important point to take home, is that it is futile, as you use the word bipolarity. I'd be careful about using it. But I get the point you're making, that, so we have a box on one register, we have humanities and the social sciences, hermeneutics and the social sciences, and on the other side, we have epistemology and the natural sciences. And what Lorty is saying is, there are moments in the discipline when they cross-cut, all right? That they don't remain within two vertical registers, but there's a crossover. In the sense that During the phase of revolutionary science or abnormal science, the sciences are primarily hermeneutic and not epistemological until they enter the phase of normal science, right? And similarly, one could argue in the social sciences that there are phases when the social sciences themselves center epistemological criteria over hermeneutic interpretation. So what the way Rorty offers, the way out and Rorty offers is that you need a spectrum. That both the sciences and the social sciences are sliding across the spectrum at different moments in the evolution, in their theoretical evolution. That's the way Rorty provides to get over this problem, to breach the divide and say, well, we have a spectrum between epistemology and hermeneutics, and the sciences and social sciences in their evolution are moving across the spectrum. All right? Does that clarify issues a little?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. We have another questions. Two more I will pick up. One is coming as in, is methodological fetishism an outcome of nature of commodified form of scholarship?
All right. I mean, yeah, that's something I had to discuss with my philosophy of science students at 9:30 this morning. There is, I think that the power of certain methods itself has promoted a kind of methodological fetishism, and I think the process of the commodification of knowledge, which really, at least we can see the discourse on the commodification of knowledge go back to the 1970s, all right? This commodification of knowledge, draws capital from a kind of methodological fetishism. For example, I really don't think data science is a science. But please don't quote me in public, all right? But the point is that the computational tools are so powerful today that, the market seems to be driving the science rather than factors internal to science driving the science. So, there's a beautiful passage in Heidegger, Martin Heidegger's On the Way to Language, where he cites a work from Nietzsche on the will to power, where Nietzsche says that in the 19th century, science was not victorious because of its conceptual development, but it was more victorious because of individual methodological accomplishment. So it was the accomplishment of method rather than triumph of science that we see in the 19th century. In other words, what they seem to be saying, that the success of the sciences has been due to certain success in its methods, all right? And that when I spoke of methodological differentiation in the early part of my talk today, I basically was referring to that process. So in each discipline then, there are methods which are specific to that discipline. And when you are socialized as a student in sociology or theoretical astrophysics, you are just trained in the methods which are specific to your discipline without having a meta perspective as to where these methods come from. I think methodology is about having a meta perspective. And what we focus on we call them courses on research methodology, but we really focus on research methods and research techniques. And this focus is what prompts that fetishism. I think the behavioral psychologist Abraham Maslow once put it very nicely. He said, when I have a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. When I have a method, I can put any problem through it,
Wow. Thank you so much, sir, for that response. So we have a little longer question. I'm going to read it out. It's from Divya Janardhan. He's asking the time and support graduate and undergraduate students need to immerse themselves in the landscape of science stand in tension with the current emphasis on problem solving and the rush to showcase the practical uses of social sciences and humanities. As a practitioner of sociology and social anthropology, I'm almost always tempted to throw Stanley Fish at everyone who asks me, what is the use of what you do? To paraphrase Fish, perhaps the most radical response to such a query would be that the humanities and to add the social sciences and philosophy has no use whatsoever, and that is deeply worrisome to place this field within a calculus of value of practical and pragmatic use. And yet, as teachers, we are but minor actors in institutional frameworks and curricular setting processes that aim to produce not critical or dialectical thinkers so much as mechanical collectors of facts about the world. I would like to hear more on how to persuade others that the big questions are important. It's quite a long question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, there's no, but yeah, you say, how do you persuade others? All right. Now, the thing is that, I know there is, and we are still in this phase where, where social science research is kind of oriented very strongly towards policy research. And my own feeling is if that kind of thing happens, that would be detrimental for social science research, most certainly. All right. I mean, how do I handle this problem? I mean, and when it is my job in a school of social sciences to introduce students to the philosophy of sciences and the philosophy of social sciences. I mean, that's part of what I'm paid to do. When I turn back to the philosophy of science, and by and large, in teaching, I don't like to use the terms natural sciences and social sciences. I much prefer to work with, although I recognize their different goals and objectives. But I also think that they are both systematic, critical, rational endeavors. So I prefer to use the term sciences. And when I look at the term sciences and I look at the goals of sciences in a historical perspective, then one can see that there are two goals to the sciences, at least two important goals of the sciences. And I'm using sciences across the science. All right. One we would call the intrinsic or the cognitive goals of science. Why do I do any kind of science? I do it because there is natural human curiosity. There is an attempt to understand the world and to maybe reach some kind of comprehensive understanding of the world. When I look at the work of a lot of theoretical astrophysicists, I don't see what utility it would have in another 100 years. All right. Or what utility would the discovery of the God particle have for society in another 100 years? I don't see anything. It's just contributing to our fundamental understanding of the world. That's all. Of course, policymakers approve huge project budgets because they have a vested interest. They know that in the attempt to discover the God particle, so I don't want to call it the God particle either, but anyway, that's another issue. In the attempt to discover it, you will come up with, or the hope is you will come up with a lot of instrumentation, some of which will spill off into the public sphere. That's the hope, right? Which is why, and it is a hope which is well-founded. But basically, the goal is to understand the world. The second is what you might call the extrinsic or the utilitarian goal of science. And the extrinsic or the utilitarian goal of science is, well, we have to survive in the world. We have to cope. We have to cope with the world. We have to cope with all the disasters we have created in the world today. All right. So we also pursue the sciences for that. Now, the thing is that we happen to live in a regime where these two goals are seen as counterproductive. And it's not that this has happened today. Today, it is emphasized a little more under particular neoliberal regimes. But I mean, if you go back and read some of the finer essays in a collection in a collection by Albert Einstein called Ideas and Opinions, there's a very nice essay on the progress of theoretical physics written in the 1920s. And over there, Einstein he's already seen what's coming, And he says, please don't see that these two kinds of research can be pursued independently of each other. You cannot disentangle them. All right? In order for you, for example, just now, we have the pandemic. We're trying, all research is oriented to looking at the virus. But maybe in the process, we would need to address some larger questions about virology and not about the vaccine. We would have to understand the nature of viruses a lot more before we resolve that issue. So there could be deeper questions of biology which could be resolved, which need to be resolved, all right, before this issue is separate, is sorted out. And on the other hand, I could be pursuing purely research which has no use, which is quite useless. And believe me, very often I introduce myself as doing research which has no value at all. All right? And that happens even within the sciences. But which could draw upon the insights which come from applied research. And I don't think that we should separate. This is the idea which I think both Popper and Adorno shared, that the world of knowledge is unified. Right? Policymakers, for whatever reasons, would like to work with certain conceptual categories. Like one of the categories invented during the Cold War was, there is pure research, applied research, and then there is technology. Right? But the world of knowledge is not quite like that. If you look at it deep down, if you excavate, what you will find is a very complex ecology in which these separations are not possible. That's my answer to your question. All right? It's not, I wouldn't agree with you that, one side is saying, policy-oriented research, and I'm saying I'm doing useless, one versus the other. No, I think we need to also emphasize to policymakers that, the world of knowledge is an ecological world, deeply, deeply, deeply connected. If you think you snap the ties here for greater optimality, it won't work. It just won't work. Yeah. I don't know if that satisfies Janardhan, but anyway.
Absolutely, sir. So we are not picking any more questions. It was, I think, more than enough to, get some input on how do we see the discourse of knowledge. And as you correctly said, the world of knowledge is definitely unified and one cannot disentangle one discourse of knowledge from another. So we definitely would love to hear from you again in future, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. Anything else I'm forgetting? So audience participants, please fill the feedback form that we have shared with you in the link and in the Telegram that you are part of. Thank you so much, Druv sir, for joining us today. Thank you. Now, all of us, we are again taking a break for half an hour. We'll again resume the session at 2:30. Please join us back for our next session, that is on drafting a research proposal, all you need to know. And we'll meet you again soon. Thank you so much. So I take your leave for this session now. Thank you so much.
Recording stopped.